Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Khaldoon Aljerian from King Saud University. He's an assistant professor in pathology and an expert certified in ethics and bioethics. Thank you very much.
هذا السلايد حكي ولا حقها؟ أظن حقها. Excellent. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for introducing me. Covered most of the ethical issues regarding clinical trials and IRB. A few points that I'll try to highlight that I feel are also important regarding authorship and publications. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors views authorship as credit and responsibility. It is credit for academic, social, and financial gain, but it is also responsibility and accountability for the published work. The four criterion that they focus on at the ICMJE are the conception or the design or acquisition, analysis or interpretation. That's number one. So it's very important that you understand that in number one it is or and not all and not and. And therefore in number one the students, the postgraduate students, undergraduate students, residents, the research assistants and associates should be recognized. So that is number one. Number two is the drafting or revising of the content. Number three is final approval. And number four is accountability for the accuracy and the integrity, especially when that is questioned, to be able to investigate and resolve any questions or queries regarding the research. Many people, I find in my experience, at least in our institute, are not recognized enough in research they have participated in because many of the PIs do not recognize that you do not need to have all of the above, but many of them are discredited for work they've performed on research. So some of the things I might go over are: what is a clinical trial? What is equipoise? What is to enumerate and understand the basic biomedical principles in ethics. Describe the consent and requirements of consent, although it has already been described by Ophelia in her presentation. We'll just briefly go over that. What is research and why is it partnership with community, and public trust and the relationship between the funding agencies, whether they are governmental, private, and the researcher, whether they are scientists or physicians, and the relationship with the community, the subjects and patients. So really a clinical trial is a specific intervention, whether it is a product, a drug or device, a procedure, or even a behavior. Usually what happens is we'll have an intervention compared to a standard or none, or two standards that are compared. To have equipoise, it means that we are not sure that this intervention is actually beneficial or better than the standard. In general, biomedical ethics, I divide it into three different ways or three different categories: clinical ethics, research ethics, and institutional ethics. Getting ready for this conference, I viewed a couple of papers that I thought were interesting regarding ethical issues in gastroenterology. And in this Journal of Gastroenterology and Hepatology, they found that the ethical conduct of research not only promotes good research, but also is in the best interest of the research subjects, investigators, sponsors, patients, and the public. And I think on the long run, many of you would agree that although much of the research may be, in someone's view, delayed by IRB or by monitoring, but on the long run, it is actually it serves to be of great benefit to the society, whether the scientific or the community. Another issue would be funding agencies and the conflict of interest where the authors disclose or do not disclose the fact of funding. They found that funding sources and conflicts of interest are still reported variably in the GI literature. So in many instances, some of the journals or some of the authors don't fully disclose the funding agencies. I think one of the important things that we need to recognize is that we will not be able to do any research without funding. Funding is a necessity, whether it is private or public. And inherently, that will carry with it some kind of bias, some kind of conflict of interest, either subconsciously or consciously. I think one of the biggest topics here in Saudi Arabia is diabetes. And if one would like to go into the funding, the pharmaceutical agencies will be welcoming. There are myriads of medicines and interventions in diabetes. And in this case, which is not actually important in the fact that as a specific case, but in general, if someone was funded to perform this research, you would look into the financial situation of any disease. So to transform it from medicine into a dollar bill. The cost of diabetes in the United States, as an example, is $245 billion. So any pharmaceutical agency will be willing to pay even millions with research regarding diabetes. There would be different approaches to the funding. You could ask to volunteer to recruit patients. You could pay the person monthly to recruit patients, or you could pay the primary investigator or the principal investigator per patient recruited. These are the different approaches that the pharmaceutical or private and public agencies may follow. One of the issues is that the community is not familiar with this type of funding for physicians. By the head is a local Arabic saying that translates, give or take, into per capita. Although it is very familiar if you are a sheep's tradesman or the percentage that is taken and known in the community by insurance companies, by car salesmen, by real estate brokers. This is not very clear to the public. It is not of pristine nature in the relationship between the physician and the public, and therefore sponsors will pay physicians to recruit patients. And legally and ethically, till now in Saudi Arabia, this disclosure is not required. However, we risk the fact that the subjects and patients are not familiar with this type of practice and may consider it as not being straightforward. In this study of undisclosed payments to doctors recruiting patients in clinical trials, you'll notice two things. One is at least 70% in every of the four categories would agree that they would like to know what the financial situation is of the principal investigator or the researchers with the funding agencies. You will also note that the percentage of patients in every single category outcounts the percentage of doctors that believe that the patients should know of this relationship. To me, the most important thing is that the patients do not understand this issue. Although we understand the issue as researchers and physicians, or physicians, that is not the important point. The important point is that we do not lose the trust that the community has given us. Once we lose that trust, we go back to the Belmont Report of 1979, we go back to Helsinki, we go back to the Nuremberg Code. And that is something we do not want to go back to. Again, just to remind you, the main principles of biomedical ethics, especially that highlighted by Daniel and Sabin in their book, Childress in their book from University of Washington, are the principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And from that, you will see that most of these reports and the IRB guidelines will follow, in general, these four principles as guidelines. And that's what they are, really. Many of the IRBs, many of the ethical, we don't have any acts, really. We have ethical guidelines in Saudi Arabia, are what they are. They are ethics. They are not law, and they are not enforced. So in autonomy basically is the basis of why we respect the dignity of the subjects and patients, why we go through the process of informed consent. The process of informed consent, and it is a process and not a mere signature on a piece of paper, has, in my mind, three important points. One is the preconditions, two, the information, and three is the consent itself, which is a process. The preconditions are concerned with the individual being competent. So in that you would think of children, comatose, and that sort of subjects will be a little bit different. The free will or non-coerced nature in which the the process of consenting is being conducted. And then two is the information. So the information is the disclosure, the recommendations, and understanding. So the disclosure and the recommendations by the principal investigator, and the understanding and the feedback, give and take between the principal investigator and the subject or patient. And last but not least, the consent itself, which is a decision through the process of informed consent and the authorization to participate in the intervention. So So of the important points in autonomy, one important point within our community or at our institute that I found that was lacking is disclosure. The other is influence. The other is intentional non-disclosure, and last but not least, withholding information. And this can be done subconsciously. It is not necessarily a conscious decision by the principal investigator. Disclosure is actually very detailed. Many of the physicians or researchers the principal investigators may feel that some or all or many of the information provided within the investigation or the intervention is not important to the patient, and that is incorrect, or the subject. So disclosure means all the information, everything that is going to happen, and when it is going to happen. Influence means something similar to what happens in some of the publicly funded hospitals, that the influence of the physician providing care may influence the care recipient to feel afraid of denying or rejecting the participation in case that regular care may be denied. Intentional non-disclosure is rare and usually is due to misunderstanding of the principle of autonomy. Withholding information sometimes, especially with rare but serious side effects. So let's say a side effect of liver bleeding that is 1 in 2,000 due to liver biopsy, that is withholding information. Whether you feel it is a rare complication is a different issue. So if you would take consent but withhold information, the informed consent is actually not valid. The signature that you have on that piece of paper that testifies that the participant is willing to participate is considered flawed. The other question would be the disclosure of the sponsor, and as I said, it is not very clear how that works. Many countries have cutoffs regarding the amount of money that you will receive as an investigator. So the issue always will be is that since there are no there is no strong enforcement of this issue, do we want to be partners with the funding agencies and the community, or do we want it to look like a scandal? Because once we are in trouble, once we are caught doing something not acceptable in the scientific community, no one will care if you didn't understand or you were misinformed. It will look like a scandal. And once it becomes like that, you will lose, or we will lose as a scientific community, we will lose trust of the community. The other important point, other than important principle, other than autonomy, is justice. Beneficence and non-maleficence are important, but seem to be highlighted more within the clinical care or care providing. So there are two important points within justice that I find, other than what is highlighted in the literature, other than the systems that are highlighted in the literature to practice the principle of justice within clinical research. So conflicts of interest and duty of care. So the conflicts of interest that we may have that may affect justice are social relationships, like ourselves. So if we are being paid for the research, or we're getting perks, we're getting funding for conferences, and then the family relationships, or relationships regarding people that you are married to, let's say, or other types of conflict of interest within the social realm. Business is pretty straightforward, since we talk about either personal business, so something that you would have, let's say, a stock ownership of a company, or the pharmaceutical company itself paying you directly or through other types of perks. Now, the duty of care is another issue which is similar to the conflict of interest, and it highlights that your duty of care is at many times to who is paying you. So you are either paid by a public or a private firm, agency. The other thing would be the community, and last but not least, the patient. So usually, or most of the time, your duty of care is a mix of these, but always you need to choose who your primary duty of care is to. One example that highlights where you would put the community forward before the patient is when you quarantine patients that have infectious disease. So in that case, your duty of care is toward the community more than that to the patient. So paying recruiters directly is wrong in principle. Not disclosing payments will compound that harm. And we become unequal partners in research. The key to long-standing research, to partner in long-standing research with the community and with the funders, is that we are equal partners. So the same way you have not biased the subjects or patients by refusing to pay them, then the recruiters should also not be paid directly. And if they are, then they should definitely disclose those payments. So how can we have just research program, or a just research program? A just research program can be reached by following different types of systems. Many systems are out there. The system that I'm familiar with and I've been trained in is A4R, which is accountability for reasonableness. What they've done is they've said that to set the limits fairly, we need to incorporate a reasonable process where everyone can be accountable for research. And they've said that these 4 points are important. It has to be public or transparent. It has to be relevant or reasonable. There has to be a method of revision and appeal by any of the stakeholders. And there needs to be a body which upholds the first 3 points, a regulation, a regulatory body that makes sure that the first 3 points are actually in process. The other point is the IRB, an IRB which will give approval and monitoring of the research program, and Ophelia has gone through the IRB for regarding approval and monitoring. The Declaration of Helsinki has incorporated A4R within the newest edition. It has been amended 7 times, and the newest edition is in 2013. And the Declaration of Taipei in 2016 has added to the Declaration of Helsinki, in addition to clinical or human subject intervention, has added health database and biobanks. And they've commented on 2 main areas as a summary of the declaration. This is not the entire declaration. The ethical principles and the governance. So ethical principles basically regarding whether they are subjects, patients, or the collection, storage, and use of data and material, databases, biobanks. They've reinstated or affirmed that dignity, autonomy, privacy, confidentiality, informed consent are important points, and they've gone through these within the declaration and explained the necessity to follow these important principles. But they've also stated that it should be very clear to the subjects and patients the purpose of the research, risks and burdens, that whether they are rare or serious or common, the right to the procedure results, even incidental findings. The participants need to realize the rules of the access, who has access to that information, how privacy will be secured, what types of governance arrangements are in put, and we'll go over those in the next slide. What type of commercial use or financial situation is related to this research? And if there's any benefit sharing, is there any third party that will benefit? And who has the intellectual property of the information, whether it is as a subject, a database, or biobank? Governance is very similar to the principles that I've highlighted. However, it goes into more detail with the administrative part of the research. So the purpose, we talked about the nature of this study in detail, the length of study in detail, how any material or information of databases will be disposed or destroyed. What is that process? And if I end my participation, what is the mechanism of disposal? Is any of the information that I've provided documented and traceable? By whom? If the ownership is exchanged or changed, or it is sold, how will that happen, and who will be in charge, and how will I be informed? That at all times appropriate informed consent can be demonstrated, that there will be protecting of dignity, autonomy, privacy, and no discrimination whatsoever. How access, data sharing will be secured, and how security of that information will be upheld regarding any data, let's say, hacking, especially that much of the information may be online, or the system may be hacked into. And how patients will be recontacted if any incidental finding or important clinical finding will be discovered. And what type of mechanism can there be any feedback? And this is the basis of A4R, where you will be able to receive and address inquiries and complaints. And that the individuals running the research, that they are professionals and they are qualified in the research that they are conducting. Thank you very much. This is just some of the references that I talked about. The other references are in the presentation itself, embedded within the presentation itself. If there are any questions, otherwise, thank you very much. Go ahead. Funding of research is ethical. Yeah? Yes. It's essential, yes. Yeah. Yes. So how much the company itself? Usually what is happening these days is that the companies will, in some of the larger multi-center studies will prepare almost all aspects of the research. And so there's no problem that they are involved and that they fund research. The issue is always that the influence on the results. So at all times, you as a principal investigator guarantee to yourself, to the community, and to the IRB that there is no bias. So they are very involved in the research, and you cannot, all you have to do is disclose. You just should tell the participants that such and such company is funding, and they have prepared the research. But there's no need to cut the funding agency off. Basically, it is the participation of the funding agencies and the principal investigators and the community as a team to forward science and medicine and healthcare. So we cannot exclude them totally, and actually that they should be involved, and they should be encouraged to be involved, to invest in research regarding healthcare. So there is no issue. The issue is always with disclosure. Not the issue is not with with being involved or not being involved. Now, other than disclosure, what can you do? I think you would be able to in some institutes, what they do is the money that is funded goes into a pot. So not directly to the principal investigator, but to the institute as a whole. But in the end, I think the key is the way the payments are made, number one, and number two, the disclosure to the participants that the payments are actually being made, or that the company is involved. But by no means should anyone understand that pharmaceutical agencies or public agencies should not fund research. They should, and it's essential that we encourage private and public institutions to be involved in research funding. I hope I try to cover. Is that okay? Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khaldoon.